Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are stepping into a seriously high-stakes world that sits right at the intersection of corporate accountability and environmental protection. We're going to look at the ISO 14001:2026 standard, focusing specifically on Clause 1 and the absolutely fascinating role of the lead auditor. I want you to think of these auditors not just as basic compliance checkers, but as environmental detectives. Their ultimate mission? To uncover the true scope of an organization's environmental footprint, cut through all that corporate red tape, and see what's actually happening on the ground.
It really begs the question, what actually happens when a company simply forgets its biggest environmental impact? Organizations sometimes try to get a little creative with how they draw their system boundaries. They might proudly certify their shiny corporate headquarters, but conveniently leave out a messy, high-emission logistics network or maybe a non-compliant hazardous waste storage facility. As we'll see from the source material, this is exactly where the auditor's detective work becomes absolutely critical.
Okay, let's dive into our investigation plan. Over the next few minutes, we'll hit 5 key phases. 1. The boundary line. 2. The interrogation. 3. The red flags. 4. The paper trail. And 5. The verdict.
Starting off with Section 1, the boundary line, establishing the EMS scope. Before an auditor can even begin assessing environmental performance, they have to figure out where the organization's environmental responsibility actually begins and ends.
And that brings us to a fundamental definition, the scope. Under ISO 14001:2026, the scope determines exactly which physical locations, organizational functions, and operational activities are governed by the Environmental Management System, or EMS. If this boundary is drawn wrong, whether accidentally or intentionally, the entire management system is fundamentally flawed from day one. I mean, you literally can't manage a risk you claim doesn't exist.
Here is a massive point derived directly from the standards. The boundary must reflect operational reality, not merely legal ownership. It isn't just about what property the company holds the deed to. The scope must encompass actual operational influence. This includes adopting a life cycle perspective and factoring in outsourced processes. Let's say a company outsources its hazardous waste disposal, but they still dictate the terms of that disposal. Well, that process is well within their operational influence.
Moving on to Section 2, the interrogation, verifying scope accuracy. This operational reality is exactly what gets tested here. It's where the lead auditor actively verifies if the declared scope actually matches the physical reality of the business.
Auditors are going to look very closely at explicit inclusions versus explicit exclusions. Explicit inclusions are the elements clearly covered by the system, like high-risk activities and directly controlled manufacturing operations. Explicit exclusions, on the flip side, are where certain activities are left out. Now, an exclusion is only justified if the organization genuinely lacks control or environmental influence. For example, a third-party cafeteria operating inside an office building where the host company has zero authority over food sourcing or waste disposal. That might actually be a valid exclusion.
But auditors don't just take an organization's word for it. They interrogate the context. They look at the regulatory environment, stakeholder expectations, technological capabilities, and the presence of high-risk activities. For instance, the source material highlights that a manufacturing organization operating in a water-scarce region absolutely must incorporate water conservation measures within its EMS scope. If water-intensive processes are excluded despite that local reality, you better believe the auditor is going to challenge that boundary.
That leads us right into Section 3, the red flags, spotting scope omissions. This is where our environmental detective goes hunting for those unjustified exclusions, looking for places where companies might be trying to game the system.
And it's fascinating because different industries commonly attempt to omit their most significant impacts in very predictable ways. In manufacturing, companies might proudly include the assembly line, but conveniently omit internal logistics, warehousing, or transportation fleets that generate massive emissions. In healthcare, they might certify the main hospital, but leave out the biomedical waste disposal facilities. In the tech sector, the shiny corporate headquarters gets included for sure, but regional offices generating significant electronic waste are quietly left off the map.
Just consider the real-world impact of these omissions for a second. If an organization manages 60% of its impacts and covers 20% for basic legal compliance, an unjustified exclusion of just 20% leaves a massive slice of environmental risk completely unchecked. Imagine a chemical plant deliberately excluding a temporary hazardous waste storage facility from its scope. That is a huge hidden liability, just waiting to cause real environmental harm.
The standard is crystal clear on this point. Exclusions can never, ever be used to avoid legal compliance. ISO 14001:2026 strictly prohibits carving out activities simply to reduce the complexity of an audit or to minimize compliance duties. If an activity generates a significant environmental impact, it belongs in the scope. Period.
So, how do auditors actually prove a company is hiding something? We enter Section 4, the paper trail, gathering audit evidence. This is the core analytical focus where our detective gathers their airtight proof.
Auditors pull from a wide array of valid sources. They look at the documented scope statements, yes, but they cross-reference those with environmental permits and legal registers. They dig into contracts and supplier agreements. They even dive into ERP systems and digital monitoring dashboards. An ERP system, for example, might reveal procurement records for a massive logistics contractor that the company claims they have no influence over. The data always tells the true story.
And they triangulate the truth through a rigorous three-step process. They don't just sit in a conference room all day. Step 1 is reviewing those documents. Step 2 is interviewing management and operational staff to see if they actually understand their environmental boundaries. And Step 3 is physical site observation. Because if the paperwork says a production line is excluded, but the auditor walks the floor and physically sees that line pouring chemical runoff into a shared drainage system, the illusion falls apart instantly.
To keep all of this completely objective, auditors rely heavily on ISO 1450. This is the standardized environmental vocabulary. By ensuring everyone uses the exact same definitions for terms like environmental aspect or operational control, the auditor ensures their evidence collection is objective, reproducible, and legally defensible. There is absolutely no room for subjective interpretation here. Finally, the investigation concludes in Section 5, the verdict, reporting nonconformances. This is where the lead auditor evaluates all the evidence and delivers their findings regarding any scope omissions.
When an auditor finds an unjustified exclusion, they issue a nonconformance. This is officially defined as a failure to fulfill ISO 14001:26 requirements. By catching these deliberate or even accidental omissions, the auditor forces the organization to drop the act, expand their boundaries, and formally address those hidden environmental risks.
So, the crucial point to take away is that this isn't just about failing a test, it's about forcing action. When an auditor issues a nonconformance for a scope omission, the organization has to implement corrective actions. They have to expand their scope, update their risk registers, and apply operational controls to those previously hidden areas. This accountability translates directly into real-world environmental improvement.
To sum up the true, uncompromising intent of the ISO standard, we really just have to remember one powerful quote from the source material. Scope must reflect the operational reality of environmental influence rather than merely the legal ownership of facilities. You can't just manage the parts of your business that look good on paper. You have to manage the reality of your actual impact.
Which leaves us with one final thought to consider today. Think about the boundaries drawn at your own workplace, or even within the supply chains of the products you use every day. Is your organization's scope revealing the truth of its environmental impact, or is it a carefully drawn line designed to hide the risk? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those tough questions.